Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I am your host, JP John Poz. With me today is a very special guest. He's booked venues all across this great land. He's a promoter. He's worked for WCW, AWA, the NWA, ROH, MLW. He is Mr. Gary Jester. Gary, welcome to the two-man power trip. How you doing?
Thank you, John. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So what is going on in your world? What have you been up to?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm doing some work for MLW. It's a really good product, excellent television production, some great people behind the scenes as well as talent. That's kind of a part-time gig. And Court Bauer was nice enough to entice me to come out of retirement after Ring of Honor closed. But I live in Atlanta. I've been here a long time. I do a lot of walking with my dog and reading and listening to music and kind of living the semi-retired life.
I love that. He brought you back, out of retirement. I love that. He kind of, I don't know, he got your juices flowing, I guess. How are you feeling about MLW and the product?
I think they have an excellent product. As I said, I think their TV production is really good. I was really impressed with it, and like I say, it's a really good group of folks. So it's nice. It's nice to be part of their team.
What are you still like booking towns and stuff for them? Like, what is your role with MLW technically?
Yeah, I help them out on the arena side, the venue side of things, which is for the most part my expertise, if you will, from my years in the industry of booking venues, running venues, troubleshooting with venues, negotiating those types of things.
So the first time I kind of can remember like seeing you and hearing of you of a young fan, Clash of the Champions 1. That was like, wow, who's this guy? He's like the judge for Flair versus Sting, the first Clash. So kind of like, how did you kind of get into like wrestling? How did you like kind of get into the business? And obviously it was before then, but when did you kind of start?
I started when I was a kid. I got hooked on wrestling when I was young, very young, watching Vern Gagne's All-Star Wrestling shows, they called it, in Minneapolis, where I grew up. And really, I didn't outgrow it as many of my friends did. And I was able to somehow get the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club, which is what Vern's organization was called, to do a spot show for me when I was 15 years old at a suburban high school, which was odd because normally they only did spot shows out of the Twin City area because they promoted every month in the Twin City area in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But they were gracious enough to give me a card, and it went really, really well. And then the next year, when I was 16, I was president of my junior class, and we did another fundraising event with Vern's group. And then I did an indie show. I had to fast forward. I kind of got out of, I was going to college after that, and I went to law school. And then after that, I did some indie shows, and then I somehow was able to get what they called the Baltimore Civic Center to rent me a date when I threatened to sue them for a monopoly on the building. And I got them to give me a date in February of '84 after I'd been on TV in Baltimore for about a year with Ole Anderson's tape. And that's kind of how it started.
So were you always like big into like wrestling? Was that like always your favorite thing? Were you always like a big fan? I know you watched Vern and stuff, but was that like a true passion of yours?
Yes, it was a true passion. It was wrestling and music and baseball. That was all before I kind of discovered girls. So, and then we threw that in. So those were those were my passions. And I was very political. I was president of the student council and president of the junior class, and so I was kind of used to doing I don't know, kind of bold leadership type things. So and being a promoter was kind of putting a lot of those things together, and it's what I wanted to do, what I thought I might be good at, and that's what I ended up doing.
I feel like as a fan, we don't even like think of like the promotion end of it a lot of times, or like the booking buildings or getting the venues or having to deal with that stuff. It seemed like at a very young age, you kind of had a grasp of that, like the business side of things and like how the inner workings work. And obviously you need the building to even have the show to begin with. Like how did like you kind of grasp and gain all that knowledge?
The venue industry always fascinated me from the time I was a kid. I would go to events and I'd look around and I'd peek in the box office, and the ticketing was always interesting, and the setup, and just this the whole operation, all the way from a small club, because I went to see a lot of live music when I was old enough to go. So I would go to a lot of the small clubs. I'd go to some of the mid-sized venues, and then of course I'd see wrestling at the auditoriums. And then I was a big baseball fan, so I would see baseball. But I was always kind of peeking behind the scenes, always asking questions, always interested in the business side. It's just something that, as I say, it piqued my interest from when I was young, and I learned as I went. I did have some mentors along the way. Vern Gagne took a liking to me, and I did a yearbook for them after Nick Bockwinkel was my first friend in the business. He also took a liking to me and my buddy who had a camera, and we did a yearbook for Vern. And I always told Vern I wanted to be a promoter. So Vern sent me for a weekend to Milwaukee to hang out with Dennis Hilgart, who died recently. A really good guy. He later went on to become one of WWF, WWE, but one of Vince's big promoters. But he was Vern's partner in Milwaukee and several other towns. And I shadowed him for a weekend when they had their show in Milwaukee on a Saturday night. And he taught me a lot about ticketing and about buildings and the nuts and bolts and such.
Wow, it's pretty amazing. Like first friend of the business is one of the greats, former AWA champion Nick Bockwinkel. How did that happen?
I'm not quite certain. Wrestling was live in Minneapolis every week. That was the headquarters of the territory, of Vern's territory, Vern and Wally Carbo. And they did it at the Calhoun Beach Hotel at a television station there. And it was a live show, and then they would send the tape of that show to the various towns. Vern was always expanding. He had several towns in the Midwest, and then expanded out west to Vegas and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And they would do interviews all day long. So I would just go there and kind of hang out. And I approached Nick Bockwinkel. I was, I think, 16 at the time. And I said, look, I'm a big baseball fan, and they produce a yearbook every year. And I think having an AWA yearbook would be a really cool thing, and kind of a classy thing for the organization. And he agreed, and he kayfabed, and he said, well, I'm going to suggest that you approach Mr. Gagne. He called everyone Mr. Gagne, because as the world champion, he has a lot of influence around here. So I knew that Vern was the owner of the territory, and Nick might have known that I've known, but he kayfabed me, so I kayfabed back. And I did then meet Vern, and Vern took, like I say, a liking to us, and we actually produced a yearbook. I had an uncle who was a printer, and he was nice enough to do a mock-up for us, a sample, which we did on Nick. We photographed him and interviewed him, and it was very professionally done. It was nicely done, and Vern really liked it, and we made a deal. And then they gave us a lot of access as far as doing photos and interviewing the talent.
That's awesome, because it's like, wow, you're kind of you're kind of in the business right then and there with the AWA with Vern Gagne.
They kayfabed all the time, but they gave us, looking back, incredible access for a couple of 16-year-olds. We were very precocious, very resourceful.
That's great though, because it's almost like you know what's up, but for some reason they were still so cautious about kayfabe back in those days.
Very much so. So we did that yearbook in '72, and then we did another one in '74. I was away at school in DC, but came back. We did that yearbook, and then Vern was nice enough to call Vince's dad, Vincent K. McMahon. I'm sorry, Vincent J. McMahon, Vince's dad. Vince's the current Vince is Vincent K. McMahon. And Vince let us do a yearbook for him. I think it was in '76. And that's when I got to know Bruno Sammartino and those people. And Vince Sr., yeah, was extremely gracious to us. And we would drive up from D.C. to Madison Square Garden and drive back the same night. But he he would give us the run of the garden to go ahead and do interviews in the back and shoot the matches, photograph the matches. So that was a pretty cool experience as well.
Wow, it's amazing. It's like Bockwinkel to Vern to Vince Senior and to Bruno. I mean, what a run for you early on in wrestling. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's true. It was. It was. I was very lucky. I mean, like I say, I was, I worked real hard at it. I was very resourceful, but there's luck involved as well. So I'm very, I was just, very fortunate.
Bruno is one of those guys where I don't know if maybe he didn't realize it or what, or he's just so humble, but it's like he almost didn't realize how big of a star he was. He was so nice to everybody. I interviewed him before, gave me like way, more time than he probably should have. I've met him before. He sits you down, he talks to you, when he's giving you the autograph. I mean, he's just such a nice guy. He was almost like, hey, Bruno, do you know you're Bruno? You're one of the biggest stars of all time. He's a very humble guy.
Very much so. When I was in my early career in DC, I worked for a member of Congress. And back then, it was in the early 80s when long distance was still a thing. It wasn't free. We didn't have cell phones. But all the congressional offices had Watts lines, which were free lines, or they would pay by the year, by the month. I don't know how it worked. But anyway, I would use the Watts line. I would get in early and I would use the Watts line. And I would call Bruno, and just as you suggest, John, he would talk with me for an hour or more. I would hog the Watts line. I got in trouble for it. But he spent a lot of time with me and was another mentor. I learned a great deal from Bruno.
Man, it's just crazy, like how friendly and nice he is, and just kind of get anybody like the time of day. Everybody was equal, even though he's obviously he's the god of wrestling, but he was like he treated everybody as an equal. It's pretty amazing, like looking at that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you kind of move on up and keep, like what happens after that? Like after AWA, then WWF, like how do you keep moving on up in the business?
Well, after the first time we were in Baltimore in '84, which was with Georgia Championship Wrestling and Ole Anderson, again, we were lucky, but I had gotten TV in Baltimore on a new station. And of course, they were on a superstation, TBS. And we drew a really big house our first time on a Thursday night. We had 8,000 people. And that launched my career. After that, the building started giving me more dates. I started we had good houses. I think, I was a good nuts and bolts local promoter. The talent liked coming there. And then when Crockett, so I eventually got in business with Jim Crockett after Georgia Championship went out of business and was bought by Vince. And then Jim Crockett Jr. was able to buy the time on TBS back from Vince. And I was working with Jimmy until they sold to Turner, which formed WCW. And I was there from the beginning until the end. And then at the end, I promoted some lucha shows for a bit and promoted some other things and got involved in real estate and such. And then got back in with Ring of Honor when I approached Joe Koff with the idea of maybe doing something with Ring of Honor. And that was a long shot that turned into another run. And when Tony Khan bought Ring of Honor, I basically retired. I've done my time.
Oh yeah, big time. Rewinding back though, how did you get in with Baltimore? I know you sold the building out and did well, but how did you kind of get into that area and that building? Were you living in Baltimore at the time?
I was living in the DC area. I was
okay.
Actually in DC and then in Falls Church, Virginia. And I was monitoring the television situation back in the early 80s. Broadcast TV was still a big deal. Cable was not everywhere. And a new station had gone on the air in Baltimore, Channel 54, WNUV, which is now, oddly enough, owned by Sinclair, which owned Ring of Honor. But back then it was just a local guy in Baltimore who got the license and put the station on the air. And I drove up there and met with the program director to see if they would be interested in wrestling. And he was a young guy about my age. We're both, kind of our late 20s, I think. And said, yeah, what time slot would you like? And I said, well, what about Saturdays at noon? He said, fine, no problem. And at the time, the first tape I had was Joe Blanchard's tape, because Joe, as you probably know or recall, if you're old enough to remember it, he was the first promoter on the USA cable network. He had the idea of going national, but he just didn't have the resources or what Nick Bockwinkel would call the moxie to really put it together the way Vince did. But the first tape I had in my briefcase was from Joe Blanchard, Southwest Championship Wrestling, and the program director was a great guy. Mark Saldich was his name, a really, really good guy. And I said, do you want to see the tape? He said, no. He goes, I trust you. I'm sure the show will be okay. And so anyway, I went through, we went Joe's tape on there, and then ended up finally with Ole's tape, which is what led me to do the show in Baltimore, because we actually let it season for a year or so, and it looked at, the ratings were good, and we thought we had a shot.
When you look at it, like when you're doing that, is it a cutthroat business as far as like the venues and booking the show, really? I mean, is that kind of a cutthroat thing, or is that just, I don't know, having savvy and maybe even a little bit of moxie, like you said, like Bockwinkel? But like, how do you kind of do that and not be a political minefield, if you will?
Well, that business has changed, as all businesses have changed. But back in the 80s, many buildings, many local arenas and auditoriums were owned and managed by the city or a county or some type of governmental body. And that was the case in Baltimore. These days, most buildings are managed privately by large arena and stadium, large venue management companies. That's the current model. And there are a handful of large ones and some small ones. But back then, a lot of them were owned by, owned and operated by, in this case, by the city of Baltimore. So when I didn't know a lot, I was 20-something years old, but I went up there and I knew they had WWF, as it was called, because I would go to that show, and I got to know their old-time promoter there, Phil Zacco. He used to give me comp tickets and complain about it all the time. He was a funny old, crusty old guy. He was one of Vince's partners back in the old WWF days. Vince and the older Vince. So I went up there and I had my briefcase and I had my coat and tie, and I explained that I had a show on Channel 54. We were doing a respectable rating, and we also could get promotion on TBS, and that I'd like to run a show. I had enough money for the deposit, and I had a little other money, and I had some some letters of reference, and I'd become a promoter with the state. And I said, I'd like to do this. I'd like a shot at this. And they said, no. They said, well, we've had WWF ever since we opened the building, or I think in the 50s. And they said, that's all the wrestling we really want or need. And I was dejected, but I did some research and I came up with a case, and I went up there and I said, you guys are city owned and operated, and you're engaging in a monopoly, with WWF. And, I threw out a bunch of case names and legal terms and, restraint of trade and price fixing and whatever, all this stuff. And I said, if you won't give me a date, I'm going to have to take you to court. And they gave me a date, which to this day, I'm kind of surprised they did, but they did. They gave me a date, and February 16th of 1984. I think the meeting I had with them was back in, October of 83. And like I said, we did 8,000 people, and that was cliche, the rest is history, is appropriate there.
That is like amazing, because it's like, oh, I'm just going to say, I'm going to sue you. And then they kind of gave in. I mean, that's crazy. Yeah. Was that a big thing, though, with WWF and other promotions as far as with the price and everything like that?
At WCW, I fought for buildings all the time with Ed Cohen. May he rest in peace. He was their arena booker for years and years, extremely competitive. We got to be pretty good friends. I got to know him, and we were always friendly, but he was ruthless behind the scenes with these arena managers. If you ever talk to any arena managers of that era, they all have Ed Cohen stories. And he was tough. So in many cases, we would go to a secondary building. In some cases, we could finally get the building to give us dates and kind of challenge Ed, because a lot of times they didn't have written exclusives, but they would have de facto exclusives and protection periods and whatnot. But if you recall, some of the biggest days we had at WCW were in domes. We were in St. Louis in what was called the TWA Dome, and I think we did 31,000 people. That was when Nitro was really hot, and we went to that dome because the arena manager would not give us a date in the Kiel Center, the only real major arena in town. And the same thing happened in New Orleans. We went to the dome there because we got shut out. And when I was doing buildings for Jim Crockett, it was the same thing. We'd go to the Kaiser Convention Center in Oakland when the Oakland Coliseum wouldn't let us in. And in Minneapolis, they had the Met Center, which we could get into because we couldn't get into the building in Minneapolis. So anyway, it was always a challenge. And and to this day, AEW, they fight with for buildings, and fortunately, there's a lot of buildings now, a lot of new buildings in the last 10 or 20 years. So many cities have two major buildings.
Is that illegal on their part in any way? I mean, that might be a crazy question,
Not really. As I later learned, and I would have probably not won the lawsuit. It's tricky, but usually if you have a good business reason for it, I mean, because in other words, where would you draw the line? Let's say there were 6 promoters that wanted to get in, and then it got to the point where no one was doing any business anymore because it had been so diluted. So we looked into that at WCW because Turner had attorneys, and we said, gee, we can't get into these buildings. And they researched it and said, yeah, most of the cases, especially when they got to the appellate level, were just that it was for business reasons. They didn't really consider this a classic monopoly the way it would be if other people, dominated in the industry. They always had reasons that the plaintiff lost.
So, do you have to book how far in advance, and is it that they can't be in that building like 6 months earlier, or how does that all work with booking maybe a building before them, and how far in advance do you book the building?
It all depends. When I was at WCW, I would try to book a year or two out if I could, at least for the pay-per-views. We would do our pay-per-views, and we'd do Halloween Havoc almost every year for a while at the MGM Grand, or there might be other venues that we did traditionally. So we'd try to book those, and then if it was Nitro, of course, I'd try to do the Nitros after that made sense from a routing standpoint, and then fill in the house shows after that. But things change along the way. And you'll see that today, even with with WWE and AEW and such, that sometimes things change, something happens, events have calendar has to move a little bit, but try to work out as far out as you can. And when you're dealing with buildings that have franchises, basketball, hockey, whatnot, then they always have first crack at dates, so you have to have second holds. And when you're booking like a WCW or like WWE or AEW do now, and you're booking a full schedule like that, it's a challenge. It's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes the pieces don't fit very well.
Do you think booking that far ahead, does that hurt some of the shows? Like, for instance, Sold Out 97, maybe they didn't know it was going to be Sold Out 97 when they booked it in advance, but then it's like, oh, it's in Des Moines, Iowa, when it could have been, in Vegas or something.
It happens. It happens. I mean, I remember when WWF had an outdoor show in LA and they moved it indoors. I think it might have been a year when maybe the attendance wasn't what they'd hoped it would be.
WrestleMania 7 with Slaughter and Hogan, yeah.
Yeah, so things like that happen. But yeah, you don't know for sure, but you have to plan.
When when you're booking shows, do you ever consult who's ever like in charge and say, "Hey, I'm booking here and there," and they have a say in it, or not really?
Um, well, I think when I was booking shows booking the calendar for Jim Crockett, I rarely. I mean, I would Dusty would weigh in, of course, and you try to take everyone's opinions into account. But I had a pretty free reign, both there and at WCW for the most part. Like I said, there were certain things that were handed to us that we had to do, like Sturgis or the Florida State Fair, or certain things where we had to do certain things. But for the most part, I chose the places um, and put the calendars together.
When you do that and you're putting the shows together and the calendars together, what is like is it just that and then you kind of done with it, or do you have to follow the process all the way through as far as like even at that day at that show you're following up with the building and making sure everything is okay?
Well, and during my Ring of Honor gig, it was just as you described. I booked it and I coordinated it and I basically ran the event. That was my job. But when I was booking buildings full time at WCW, and we were doing shows, every night, or maybe on every Monday and then every weekend, plus pay-per-views and such to go with the house shows, I was not at every show, and there were a team of people that reported to me that would promote the shows, that would take care of ticketing and just the actual nuts and bolts housekeeping things that go into every event.
So you technically don't need to like travel to every show, so to speak, like when you're doing that job.
No, but I did. I traveled to a lot of them, and then at Nitro, for a long time, I would produce the local market interviews that we would do to promote the local towns. We had a little portable interview box that we would set up somewhere, in the back of an arena, and either Lee Marshall or Gene Okerlund would do the mic, and we had a cameraman and an audio guy, and we'd do the local market interviews, and it was always the mid card guys who would be willing to do them. Chris Jericho, Jeff Jarrett, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero. Those guys did a lot of those interviews for us.
Well, that must have been fun. Was that like a cool experience? Because obviously that's different than in booking town stuff. I mean, was that a lot of fun?
It was. It was. It was sometimes frustrating. But it was always a coup when I could get like a Bill Goldberg or a Ric Flair or someone, because it was not an official process. They never put out a list like, "Hey, you are going to do these." We would show up and I would go ask. I'd say, "Hey, can you please come in and, cut 4 or 5 interviews for us for these towns?" And like I said, the mid card guys, they were smart, because it was a way to get themselves over, and to in many cases just kind of hone their craft if they were these guys, they were young at the time, so it worked for all of us.
What was the relationship like with Zane Breslov, who's a name that kind of always comes up with even Bischoff talks about him, and I I do a show with Kevin Sullivan. Kevin always talks about you and Zane, so and always puts you over. But what was the relationship like with Zane?
Zane was like a big brother. We just kind of took an instant liking to one another. Sometimes I would talk to him literally a dozen times in a day. Now, oftentimes those calls were maybe a minute in duration. And then once we had pagers, Zane would page like a dozen times a day. That was just Zane. He was zany, and then it was a perfect name for him. But he was a character in so many ways, and we got to be very good friends. I'd been to his home. He was at my home. I know his widow, his kids. He knew my ex-wife, my then wife, and anyway. So yeah, we would talk a zillion times a day, and basically, once he came on, he promoted the events. So I booked the buildings, and he promoted the events, and we were, I think, a really good team. We complemented one another. and it worked. And Zane, like I say, Zane was just a real character. He was, someone could write an interesting book, like a Carl Hyacin type novel featuring Zane, and it would, I think it would be a good read.
Do you think he was like a key to the success as far as like being a promoter of WCW? Because it seemed like, once Hogan obviously comes in, I mean, everybody ups their game, but it just seemed like maybe Zayn is kind of like a underappreciated kind of guy behind the scenes that he really helped them promote shows.
Yeah, and I don't know that he was underappreciated. I think he was greatly appreciated. He was had a big run with WWF, as they called it then. So it was kind of a coup when we were able to bring him on.
Right. Yeah.
He had relationships with morning disc jockeys were a big deal back then. Shock jocks, and Zane had relationships with them, and Zane, was constantly in touch with talent and getting them to do things. Hogan and Savage, and top talent, and he just, he knew how. Zane knew how to take a product that had a certain amount of visibility and popularity and take it up a notch. If you've got nothing to sell as a promoter, as I learned, it really doesn't matter. If you don't have something that piques the public's interest, then all the promotion in the world's not going to matter. But if you have something that's pretty good and you've already started to see some results with it, then a good promoter will take that up several notches, and that's what Zane would do, and that's just kind of what promoters do. And he would get guests on the morning show. He did a deal, this was way before the internet or buying tickets online, where we would have talent in the box office the day the tickets went on sale. We did it with Goldberg in DC, and we did it with, Randy Savage used to do a bunch of them. And it was huge. We'd get a big crowd of people, and it became an event in and of itself. And you could tell back then from your first day of sales how your event was going to do. It was a pretty good barometer.
When you're like kind of in the thick of it and you're doing things like that, is it easier when it's like you got the NWO or it's like Goldberg was hot? Is it easier kind of to sell buildings and do that when the product is hotter, just as far as booking the buildings and not
Oh
having any
yeah.
sort of problems?
Oh, totally. Yeah. In fact, it flips sometimes. When we were hot with Nitro, I would get calls from buildings, and I would get calls returned from buildings that managers that didn't return my calls before, and I'd get some yeses, that used to be no's. I mean, it's a small industry. They, building managers obviously talk with one another. They want to know what's hot and what, who's promoting whatnot. And again, this was way before the internet, so networking was just huge. And yeah, they follow it closely. It was way easier to do business when you've got a hot product and everybody knows it.
I remember going to shows, obviously WWF and WCW during the Monday Night Wars. I'm in the New Jersey area, but I went down to Philly a bunch. And you guys, WCW always had the Spectrum, and they had
Yeah,
WWF always had the Wells Fargo.
yeah,
Is that
exactly.
literally them saying, "No, this is our building, that's yours"? Like, how did that work?
They managed both buildings at the time. It was the same company that managed both buildings, and it's like, hey, we have an exclusive with WWF at the whatever they called it when they opened it. I think it's
Wachovia
now
Center when they opened it. Now it's Wells
no,
Fargo.
it was something before that. It
Oh,
was first.
Core State
Yeah,
Center.
or First Union at one time, because
Oh
then
yes, yes. Oh
First
my God, they
Union
had four or five names.
First Union merged with Wachovia, and they kept the Wachovia name. Anyway, it was a cool building. It was the first building I saw that had a microbrewery in it, and I knew the building manager, quite well. Over time, because I'd go into these conventions, I got to know a lot of building managers, even where they wouldn't do business with us. And when WWF went into the new building, he said, "Well, we'll rent you the Spectrum," and we did real good business in the Spectrum.
Do you think that it's like, oh, WWF's up here, they get the new building. Did that have anything to do with it? Because you guys were hotter at that point in '98 when you
They
guys were
had the
running the Spectrum.
relationship. They had the relationship with that company going way back. This was private management situation. They'd already built the relationship before the building was built when they did the Spectrum. And when we did the Spectrum, we used to do the Civic Center over at University of Pennsylvania. So from way back, and it's the same thing today. AEW goes to the Leah Corse Center at Temple University. because WWE goes to the Wells Fargo Center.
Man, I guess that everything is like a relationship business, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
loyalty and relationship business, crazy.
Loyalty and just bottom line business. Now, when it gets, to be where I think if WWE maybe does one event a year in a building, that's different. I'm not sure what the commitments are these days, but it used to be they would commit to enough events that would be enough wrestling for a building.
Did you ever have any with Cohen and WWF? Did you ever have like a relationship with him, or no? It's almost like combative. You guys couldn't really have a relationship.
It was always combative. I mean, we were friendly personally, but the business relationship was always combative. We never worked together on anything.
Does Vince have anything to do with like that part of the business, or that's just Cohen doing his thing?
I never worked there. I'm sure that knowing Vince, I think Vince probably had his hand in virtually everything back in those days.
Oh, definitely. What about you and Bischoff? Did you guys have a good relationship?
We had at one time, and then it became not so good.
I know I always talk to Kevin Sullivan. I don't know if you guys still talk, but he always puts you over. Like you always did a good job and stuff like that. So, do you still talk to Kevin or not really?
I do. Kevin's one of my last remaining friends of the era. So many of them have died. Nick Bockwinkel, died, and Roddy Piper was a friend of mine, died, and Bruno, of course, died. So, Kevin's one of the last ones standing. Very, very bright guy. Kevin is really well read, knowledgeable on history of the world, of various countries and regimes and wars and religion, and just very, very up to date on current events and quite a knowledge of history.
Yeah, it's funny. We were just talking a few weeks ago about Clash of Champions 1. And I guess he couldn't remember. I said, "How come Gary Juster was one of the judges?" Obviously I think they called you a wrestling official or something. But obviously, did you book that venue? Did you book that town? And
No.
did you know you were going to be a part of the judging?
No, they just asked me to do it. I Jim Crockett Jr. excuse me, gave me more opportunity than probably anybody in the business. When I started working with them, he had me promoting towns all over the country, new towns for them, where we'd get a television clearance, and I would go in and promote the town. So, excuse me, he just liked me a lot, respected my abilities, always, told me, he was just really, really good to me. And they, I had been known at that time, I guess, as, quote, the Baltimore promoter, and because we had a lot of success in Baltimore. And I think by that time I'd promoted the Meadowlands in New Jersey and done some big shows. So Jimmy just called and said, "We'd like you to come and do this." And I said, "Okay."
So funny. Like if you just look at like the panel of the judges for Flair versus Sting, obviously 45-minute time limit draw. It ends at Clash 1, but it's you, Jason Hervey, Ken Osmond, obviously Sandy Scott was there, and Penthouse model Patty Mullen. So it was like, wow, what a weird like.
It was weird. And the weirdest thing to me was they smartened up Patty Mullen. They told her who to vote for, and all they had to do was let her vote first, and then Sandy and I could have voted accordingly.
Oh, they didn't mention to you that, hey, you got to vote for Sting? They didn't mention that to you?
Yes, they told us all who to vote for.
Oh, okay.
And normally, if this was not 2023, I would not break kayfabe, but now there's no kayfabe left. But back then there was, and they didn't have to tell her who to vote for. All they would have done is let her vote, and then we could have voted accordingly for the finish. If she votes for, she goes, "I vote for Sting." Well, then I could have said, "Well, I vote for Flair," and then Sandy would have said, "Well, it's a tie. I vote for that. It's a tie." And that you could have gotten the same result. Just let her vote first.
Good point. Yeah. I just was always
But
curious.
I wasn't the. It's booking wasn't. I didn't interfere with that, so I didn't say anything. Plus, it was too late once they smartened her up.
And I don't even know if Jason Hervey and Ken Osmond even voted in it.
No, it was Sandy and Patty and me, I think.
Yeah, I know they were out there, and I guess
they were there. They were there. Yeah, celebrities.
Great match though, Flair and
Yeah,
Sting. Great match.
yeah, absolutely. That kind of gave Sting his first real shot at stardom.
What was your relationship like with the Nature Boy, Ric Flair? Because obviously you guys probably been up and down the roads together.
Always good. Always a
Did
good
you
relationship.
did you go out with him and stuff, party with him and stuff, or
In
you're
the
not?
in the beginning, I did, because that was Ric's MO. Ric, and I say this, with affection. Ric was always really good to the new guy, and whether it was me or someone else, and we'd go out and Ric would buy the drinks, etc. So yeah, I did that for a little while, but I worked with Ric for all those years, traveled with him some. We always had a good relationship, and as I told Ric when I met Ric real briefly when he was a Gagne trainee, but didn't know him then, and he certainly wouldn't have remembered me. It was just a hello. But once I started working with him, when he came to Baltimore for our second show in '84, I told him that his father had delivered me and showed him my birth certificate. So we always had kind of a bond of sorts after that.
Oh
I
wow,
don't think anyone else in wrestling can say that.
no, definitely that's amazing. I didn't know that. Wow, what a cool story. Wow, so
Yeah.
his dad, or his I guess it would be foster father, right? He was the
Not foster, adoptive.
adoptive. I'm sorry, adoptive
Yeah, they
father.
adopted him, and they were his parents growing up.
Well, that's amazing though that you kind of had that proof. I mean, that he must have been glued to you right away. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. So whenever I see Ric now, he always tells the person next to him, whoever that is, it's like, "Hey, my dad delivered Gary when he was born."
Wow, damn, that's so cool.
Yeah,
It's like an instant connection with the goat there. That's awesome.
yeah. I think it's truly unique. I think it's one of a kind in wrestling. Maybe there will be another one that will surface, but yeah, Ric's dad, Dr. Richard Flair, was a very prominent OBGYN in Minneapolis, and my mother and many of her friends went to Dr. Flair as their doctor. So when I was a kid, Dr. Flair was a household name. That was my mother's doctor. It's like, yeah, I'm going to see Dr. Flair today. So he delivered me and my brother.
Wow, amazing. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, definitely one of a kind story. There's nobody else going to be able to say that. That's for sure. That's really cool.
Yeah, yeah. So that's part of the legacy.
And I think, if I remember correctly, Clash of the Champions 2, Luger gets jumped and beat up by the Horseman. And I'm pretty sure you pop out of the limo before. I don't know if you remember that or what was going on there, but I think that was you before Luger gets beat up by the Horseman in the back. Not sure if you remember that or not. Still there? Can you hear me? Hello. You're
My
back.
my phone rang and it cut you off, so it may ring again and cut you off again. I don't know how to prevent that.
Oh, okay. It's no problem. Yeah, no, StreamYard can be weird on the phone, I guess. I was saying Clash 2, Luger gets
Mhm.
jumped and beat up, but I think you're in the limo, you come out, and then he gets jumped by the Horseman.
Yeah, I have a vague recollection of that one. A much clearer recollection of the first one.
Did they say anything to you like, hey, we're going to put you on TV more? Or it's just one of those things where it just kind of comes up spur of the moment. You pop in, pop out. Nothing like you're going to be on the show more often.
No, it was just as you described. It was just here and there. I never asked to do it. I was glad to do it when they asked me. As I say, I was at that point, I was, and still even to this day, but back then I had to pinch myself that this was really happening, that I was actually able to make a living doing this, something that, I had fantasized about. So if they asked me to do anything like that, of course I would say yes, because I was so thankful that I was accepted in the business by, people who didn't accept people into the business very, very willingly or readily. It was unusual. So, whether it was, Nick or Vern or, at that time, Jim Crockett, if they said, hey, we'd like you to do this, like you to be on TV, it's like, sure, I'll do that.
Very cool, very cool. And kind of just fast forwarding to your days in Ring of Honor, I remember you actually had a match. I guess it was the unauthorized show. It's like
It
unscripted.
was,
How
it
did
was
that
a
happen?
it was a comedy thing. And it's the thing that in my day, I never would have done in the kayfabe era. But the crew had come back from, I think it was England, and there were some things that happened, and that people, their spirits were down, the business wasn't good. And at the time, anyway, Colt Cabana asked me to do it, and I said I would do it. So it was like a comedy thing where I went in and slapped or chopped the Mecca, as he called himself. It was, like I say, it was kind of a comedy thing, and I wouldn't have done it ever, in the kayfabe era. But once we were kind of in this situation, I thought it sounded like an okay idea at the time. I would not do it again at this age. I wouldn't do it again.
So there wasn't something like, oh, I got to get in there. I got to wrestle. I want to be a wrestler. Well, at least once. That wasn't going through your head.
No. Many years ago, when I was younger, I had a colleague. You might be aware of him. His name was Bob Pope. He worked Knoxville. Was a promoter for many years. A really, really good guy. And he once did an angle where he got color. And when I had Baltimore really hot and the fans knew me, I said that to my then wife one day. I said, maybe I should do an angle like Bob did and get some color, and we'll come back with a rematch and draw a big house. She said, if you do that, I'll divorce you. Well, we ended up getting divorced anyway, so I probably should have done it. But I never did. I never really had that big of a desire to do it. And like I say, when Colt asked me, and then it was with the Mecca, Brian Johnson, who I like a lot, and he's an upcoming guy, and really works hard and stuff, and we were very friendly. So I said, yeah, I would do it. But no, it was never. I was never a big deal for me. I was never wanting to be, a wrestler, so to speak.
Should have told Nate, hey, Nate, I want to get in there with you,
Yeah. I guess we could, but no.
As we wind it down here and we head towards the finish, the ROH, MLW, AWA, NWA, WCW, WWF, or really Worldwide Wrestling Federation. I mean, you've kind of been there, done that, worked everywhere. If someone were to say like, oh, Gary Jester, or, maybe they were doing a podcast about you, or I don't, maybe somebody wanted to mention you and say, oh, what was his legacy, or what's the stamp? Like, how would you almost describe, because booker of promoter booker, how would you kind of describe yourself, like legacy wise, stamp wise?
I was a kid who loved pro wrestling, who fantasized about being a guy behind the scenes, and becoming a wrestling promoter and working on a big stage. And I had the opportunity to do that, and I'm just really thankful that I did.
Any regrets looking back? Anything you wish you would have done?
Katharine Hepburn said it best when she was in her 90s and she was being interviewed, and someone said, Miss Hepburn, do you have any regrets? And she said, young man, only idiots have no regrets. And I will just leave it at that.
Wow, well said. Yeah, for sure. Was there anything you wanted to do in the business that you never got the chance to do?
Not really. There was when we got the Madison Square Garden deal with Ring of Honor in 19, I think it was. The word around the office was, and I know Greg, our GM, used to always say, that Gary always, said that the one thing he could never do is run the Garden, and now we can run the Garden. So that was one thing I had always wanted to do was do an event at Madison Square Garden because it's the Garden. And so we were able to do that, which was pretty cool.
Was that shocking? Because it seemed like Vince owned that building, you know, and his dad owned that building, and maybe even his grandfather Jess owned that building, right?
What was shocking to me was that when WWE did WrestleMania that year at the stadium in New Jersey, I thought they would divvy up the house shows. I thought they'd give, say Monday night to one of them, the Garden, and SmackDown or whatever to Barclays, and then another to Prudential in Newark. Those were the big three, and I thought they'd divvy it up, and they didn't. They made the deal to do everything at Barclays, and the Garden was frankly pissed off about it. So yeah, it's still kind of surprising looking back that happened, but they were really interested because they wanted to be part of that weekend. They knew it would be big, and it was. I mean, we sold that show out, almost instantly.
It's funny. I talked to a couple wrestlers, and the scuttlebutt was that Vince was like furious that somebody else was running the Garden, but it was like you guys decided to run someplace else. So the Garden was probably mad at you that you weren't running there when you had WrestleMania that week. Crazy.
Oh yeah, they definitely were. Yeah, they I think thought that they would be included. I think all the buildings did.
What was your kind of just favorite building besides like working MSG, like you said you want to do? You got to be. What was like your favorite building to book, or maybe the best building you think that you were able to book and promote?
I don't know if there's a best building to promote, but the one has the most kind of sentimental value to me is Baltimore, because it's where I started. It's where I had my first sellout. It's where I, built a lot of personal relationships, with people there. So, that was definitely my favorite for those reasons.
Do you look at it and have like a favorite promotion that you work for, or are they all kind of equal, or is somebody stick out above another one?
That's a good question. There were pluses and minuses everywhere. Overall, I just had really good experiences everywhere. Good experience working with Ole when they had Georgia Championship, and then the Crockett's and WCW. I was there from the beginning until the end, and of course Ring of Honor, which was really a really good experience. So I don't have any real complaints about any of them. And it's funny. I always said I never worked at WWF, but I did do those. I did do that one book for the elder Vince. So I guess I did. I did have some experience there after all.
Oh yeah, that counts. Yeah, you worked there, of course. You pretty much
So
worked for
we'll
every
count that one.
major promotion ever, if you think about it.
Yeah,
you have to count it. So what's next for you?
Like I say, I'm working with MLW, which is a lot of fun. Very flattering that they wanted me to be on their team, and I'm trying to, as my friend Jim Ross would say, live my best life.
Now, just one final question, just because it always kind of was curious to me, because like we talked about with you, I mean, you worked everywhere, you've done everything. Like that old school, like local promoter system, how come they don't do that today, really? I mean, was it a different day, bygone era? It just seems like that territory system, or that old school promoter system, like the local show, it just seems like that's gone. Like, how come that isn't employed today, really?
Because if you think about it, virtually everything local is gone. There is no more local. I mean, there's mom and pop restaurants and such, but for the most part, everything is corporate. Look at television now. Everything is big. Everything is corporate. It's just the internet changed everything, and then social media, changed it in an exponential way.
Will you be bringing back the old school sessions, your old podcast? Will you ever be bringing that back?
No one has ever asked that before. I would say unlikely. I would say unlikely. I don't do very many of these. Mark Kruskal asked me if I would do yours, and put you over real big. So I said I would, but generally, and it's been more of a behind the scenes person. So I don't do a lot of these things. I did that during the pandemic as a way to at least try and contribute when things were down. But it's just not something that I generally do.
Before we let you go, is there social media or anything out there as far as like you promoting yourself in social media, or no, you're happy in retirement and stay nice and quiet?
Yeah, I've never been one to promote myself on social media.
All right, Mr. Chester, I appreciate all the time today. It's awesome kind of going down memory lane and even learning something too, because that side of the business, the promoter booking and booking buildings, I mean, just so fascinating. Obviously, you played a pivotal role in a lot of major shows, major booking venues, and a lot of part of the business. So, Mr. Chester, thank you so much, or Gary, excuse me, thank you so much for all the time. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.